I intentionally ended the period of Upanishads with the yoga of social interactions, because the next period, the next text, and the next milestone in the history of yoga is Bhagavad Gita. So what essentially is Bhagavad Gita? The main epos of Indian tradition, not mentioning Vedas, but Vedas are rather the proto-text, not the epos, is Mahabharata. The scenario of Mahabharata evolves from cosmogony to some moment of climax, which is the following. According to Indian astrologers, about 4 to 4,500 years ago, there existed two clans. However, scientists consider them to exist later, about 3,000 years from now, but nobody doubts their existence. So there existed two clans, which actually were cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who started the clash to rule over the India of that times. And the climax of this war, which durated many years, was the battle on the Kuru field. Both clans gathered a huge amount of allies, and in fact all the India were split into two warring parties, which had to battle and to share the power at last. So, as I said, from one side there fought brothers Pandavas, and from the other brothers Kauravas. Among the Pandavas, the most heroic was considered to be Arjuna, the silver one. The root arj means to shine, from which the Latin word argentum is derived. The silver-haired Arjuna was considered to be the best warrior in the world. Surely he had to take part in this battle, and most probably if he would take part in this battle, he would have changed its course and make the Pandavas victorious. But when he drove his chariot between the two armies and observed these armies, the huge doubt had possessed him. So what was this doubt? On one hand there stood his brothers, on the other his cousins. Together with his cousins there stood Drona, his teacher and the teacher of all his brothers. There stood Bhishma, their grandfather. There stood all his other relatives. And then Arjuna realized and asked himself, if I am doing the right thing, if I will enter this battle I would kill everyone I love. Maybe it's not worth fighting for. By the way, it's the first detailed description of depression in the history of humanity. And here all the symptoms are described. As his palms got sweat, as he couldn't hold the bow, as sorrow has possessed, and so on. So what in fact this chapter is about? Note that the chariot metaphor is not arbitrary here. And we remember that the chariot metaphor is the metaphor of the human body, which has horses, the indriyas, the senses, which has the charioteer, who by the way was Krishna himself, and which actually has the owner of the chariot. But in this situation Arjuna actually says the following, that if I fight, I would spoil my karma. And if I don't, then my brother would get killed, and I would also spoil my karma. So what should be done in this situation? Which dharma do I choose? In fact, what is described in this situation is the situation of existential choice. Just note that anyone develops when he gets in the situation of existential choice. When in some situation which he gets into, his usual social roles start contradicting each other. In this situation one has only two choices. Either depression or reviewing his or her side of the situation, changing the vision, review one's social positioning, change one's attitude to the situation, change its identity, and so on. So the situation the Arjuna was in is the brilliant exemplification of the situation of existential choice. I think that it's one of the first descriptions of this choice in the history of humanity. And notice that the interpretation which I'm giving you is not the development of the psychologists of 20th and 21st century. The first description of Bhagavad Gita as the internal conflict was given by the Abhinavagupta, the philosopher of 8th century AD in the Kashmir Shaivism. At least it's the first description of this sort known to me. Surely he hadn't used the word existential, this word is of 20th century. But apart this, he viewed Bhagavad Gita as the arena of internal conflict. And in this situation of internal conflict, when Arjuna fell into complete despair, then talked Krishna, his charioteer. And we remember who is the charioteer. It's the mind who started leading him out of this crisis, telling him different techniques. Essentially in the same way as Yama had proclaimed yoga to Nachiketas, Krishna had also proclaimed different aspects of yoga to Arjuna. In fact, each chapter of Bhagavad Gita is this or that yoga. The first one is called the yoga of Arjuna's sorrow, the second one is called Sankhya yoga, the third one is karma yoga, etc. In fact, he gave different methods using which one could get out of this crisis. These methods were of different complexity, nuances and details, but nevertheless. So, yoga of Bhagavad Gita. In fact, in the second chapter, Krishna had already formulated the meaning of yoga to Arjuna. Yoga is a wisdom, knowing which you can free yourself from the bondage of deeds, the bondage of karma. Hindus had liked the dialogue genre very much. And further, the author of Bhagavad Gita had developed the whole range of different aspects of yoga. Some nuances in Bhagavad Gita resemble to us, literally, lines known from Upanishads. Moreover, in Bhagavad Gita there are lots of lines directly copied from this or that Upanishad. I noticed at least 2 same lines in Katha Upanishad, maybe there are more of them. For example, the idea that yoga is control. The chariot metaphor had remained, the idea that one should control Indriyas had remained, but this idea started developing. If Katha Upanishad had discussed only the control of Indriyas in the way that they wouldn't go to the external objects, but in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita the following line is mentioned. The one who controls external senses, but is bound to the objects inside himself, is the liar anyway. For example, you can close your eyes and pretend that it has nothing to do with you, but if you are thinking about this, so it has something to deal with you. Your energy, your indriyas are still there, but some nuances of yoga of Bhagavad Gita are radically different from the yoga of Katha Upanishad. Some ideas which were new in principle appeared there. For instance, there is a new definition of yoga. Samatvam yoga uchyate. Sama is like same in English, tva is the existential suffix. Yoga uchyate is called yoga. Such evenness of mind is called yoga. So now, not only the control of senses is called yoga, but also the evenness of mind. And the evenness among what? To understand this line, one must understand the European tradition. The tradition of Stoicism, where you can accept both highs and lows, both upsides and downsides, successes and flaws, positive and negative. So ability to be in the middle of these extremes, holding the evenness of your mind, this is yoga. But this is a more subtle development of the idea of control. The next definition given in Bhagavad Gita is yogaha karmasu kaushalam. Karmasu in all actions, kaushalam the art. Yoga is the art in all actions. So yoga is not just some internal control, but it's the effectiveness of reaching one's goals, the ability to be socially adaptive, be successful, and so on. The next very important idea of Bhagavad Gita is the following. Those who are resolute in this path have one point in mind. Many branched and endless are the thoughts of the irresolute. So this line introduces the idea of totality. Besides the idea of control, Bhagavad Gita adds this idea. So if we are doing some action, we are totally in this very action, but not in everything else. We don't scatter ourselves, we don't go to other sides, we act in just one direction. There was nothing like this in Katha Upanishad. We haven't seen this in Vedas, but this is a very important motive. Later, in the medieval yoga, especially in the Kshatriya styles of yoga, this motive was one of the main ones. And in my blog I wrote the parable about the king Vikrama who summoned the god Agni. And by what means could he summon this god? He said that if I make the sacrifice and the gods will not accept it, the next sacrifice will be my head. So this totality, this concentration on just one purpose, this is yoga. And this is also the idea in Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is the first to formulate the samadhi as the goal of yoga. But here we have a very interesting moment, because the line which introduces the samadhi category sounds like the following. When your mind, no longer confused by the scriptures, remains steady and stays grounded in samadhi, then you shall attain yoga. And notice, no longer confused by the scriptures. And the scriptures are the traditions. Consider this, it's not when now someone can not be confused by the scriptures. It's back then, in the Vedic period, when everybody is in some state of karma, dharma, doing some Vedic rituals, and then you just realize that you can base not on the scriptures, but on your own understanding, on your own samadhi. And the samadhi category would be discussed further when we will talk about the Yoga Sutra. Just imagine which courage is needed to find the base in yourself, but not in something external. And about the grounding in oneself, Bhagavad Gita has several shlokas. So here, a new value of yoga is introduced. And then if we consider Bhagavad Gita in some broader than in just context of yoga, however, everything in Bhagavad Gita is considered to be a part of yoga. There are many new ideas which are introduced in some larger perspective. For instance, the concept of social responsibility. The wise should not unsettle the mind of the ignorant ones who are attached to the fruits of work, but the enlightened one should inspire others by performing all works efficiently without selfish attachment. And the previous line says the following. If you stop actioning, or Arjuna, If you abandon your duties, then all the people who are lower than you in status will also abandon their duties. They will also stop doing what they should. The spiritually developed person should be an example for the others. With his actions, he should motivate the others to act as well. That's the concept of social responsibility. Further, there is an absolutely amazing idea of Bhagavad Gita about following one's own nature. All beings follow their nature. Even the wise act according to their own nature. What then is the value of its restraint? The very idea that the human has his own nature, that he has to follow it, that it deals nothing to do with his mind considerations or social values or anything else, this is very not obvious. In fact, humanity has reached this idea once more only 2,500 years later. In the humanistic psychology, the ideas of Maslow, of self-realization, is conceived here in Bhagavad Gita. Then there are ideas of individualization and the idea of dharma. It's far better to perform one's own dharma, though tinged with faults, than to perform another's dharma, though perfectly. And here again we realize two things. One thing is that the human has his own nature, his own dharma which he has to follow, and it's different from the dharma of other animate beings. We cannot write general laws to fit each person. You have to find your own dharma. And then this line contains a powerful, genuine and global spiritual load, because here in fact it's assumed the idea of the transcendence of social institutions. What is dharma? Dharma is some social role which the man plays. It's some function the person must perform, like a profession. For instance, we are starting some professional activity. What do we encounter from the very beginning? We encounter some difficulties. Each profession requires some qualities, some skills, some ways of interacting with people. To become a professional in any deed, one has to transform oneself from inside, and the person often doesn't want to. Then he stays in the low end of his profession and earns less money. And to earn money one must admit that dharma, his social function, is higher than himself. It contains something which you don't understand. Your limited shell of personality doesn't include all the greatness of social institution. And if we consider the further development of these techniques, we could look at the Sufi tradition. There is this book called The Teachers of Gurdjieff, and there the teaching process of Sufi is described. When Gurdjieff just started his practices, he was very twitchy, a harsh guy, and he was said, "Don't hurry to study Sufism, first start coining the dish." And he was made to be a coiner's apprentice. And in coining there is one simple rule. You can be however masterful, but if you apply a little more pressure, then you would spoil the coining. So in this way, the man deals with his harshness. Then when he finished studies with this, he was sent to be the Sufi beggar's apprentice. And he was walking around and gathering alms, because he had lots of pride. But beggar is also a profession. If you are ignorant gathering alms, you would receive nothing. So there is some other, more gentle way of dealing with people. So in this way he gained gentleness, by means of new professional activity, by means of new dharma. Then he was sent to madrasa, the school, to be the Sufi professor's apprentice, to learn how to communicate with people, and so on. So each dharma, each profession has its spiritual load, its spiritual potential. These are more late teachings, but the idea was first written in Bhagavad Gita. And then Bhagavad Gita first mentions of Hatha Yoga. Note that in the Katha Upanishad there was nothing told about the Hatha Yoga. Our perception of yoga as Hatha Yoga has developed much later. It was developed in 11th and 12th century AD. So 3,000 to 4,000 years before that, yoga existed in a completely different way. It was perceived more like a spiritual teaching, a psychological teaching, a way to control emotions, the indriyas, the senses, controlling the mind, and so on. And only much later Naths had introduced the idea of Hatha Yoga. But apparently there existed some basics of Hatha Yoga in the antiquity. And Bhagavad Gita mentions the following line. Others offer as sacrifice the outgoing breath in the incoming breath, while some offer the incoming breath into the outgoing breath. Some odiously practice pranayamam and restrain the incoming and outgoing breaths, purely absorbed in the regulation of the life energy. In the moment we want to inhale, but are stopping ourselves from doing this, we sacrifice the prana to apana. And when we want to exhale and not doing this, then we sacrifice apana to prana. Though it's written metaphorically, but we clearly realize that some pranayamas already existed by that moment. And speaking frankly, asanas are not mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. There is actually a lot more to find in Bhagavad Gita. I intentionally named this slide Yogas of Bhagavad Gita, because these yogas are many. For example, in Bhagavad Gita, the Jnana Yoga categories are described, as well as the categories of Bhakti Yoga, about the transcendence using emotional means. And what is transcendence? The sense of yoga, as well as of any other spiritual teachings, is to transcend one's own borders, one's own margins. There is always some shell, some shelter in which one exists, and the question is how to get out of this shell into something bigger, how to transform oneself. One of the ways actually is the karma yoga, the seeing of transcendence in your own profession, in your own social function. The other way is to go deeper within oneself and to acknowledge something inside oneself. Another way is Bhakti Yoga, in which you go through the very bright emotions. You are